A group of African and NATO countries kicked off the 20th edition of the African Line military exercises in Morocco this week. The drills are the latest sign of how global powers are seeking to boost their security ties with the continent. And it comes at a time when Russia and China are also working to increase their presence there, both militarily and economically. Under the joint leadership of the Moroccan and US militaries, thousands of troops took part in the drills. Called the biggest of its kind, the exercises will continue until the end of this month in several areas of central and southern Morocco. Washington and Rabat first launched the African Line exercises in 2007, which are held annually with the participation of European and African armies. Last year, South Africa hosted naval exercises with Russia and China, which raised alarms in the West. And in January this year, a senior US general had warned that Moscow was working to expand its influence among African countries. And for more on the military drills in Morocco, joining me now from Milan is Chiara Lovotti. She is a research fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. And from Washington, D.C., William Lawrence is a former U.S. diplomat who served across North Africa. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, William, what are these exercises looking to achieve? What potential scenarios are they training for?
Any and all threats to the 27 countries involved. There's a lot of humanitarian and medical work. I was actually involved in one of these maneuvers once as an interpreter, and I was surprised how much during these activities they're trying to interact with local populations and learn how to deal in cross-cultural situations with, for example, dealing with illness and that sort of thing. But in terms of the hard military side of it, it's air, land, and sea cooperation for any sort of operation that they're engaged in together. Most of the cooperation between the United States and the Maghreb and Sahel countries over the last 20 years, and the reason why much of this got funded was for counterterrorism operations in Mali and elsewhere. But when they're training for regional war, they're training for terrorism, they're training for even counter narcotics at times, so going after traffickers of various kinds. So a lot of these trainees are younger. They're from National Guard areas. We have troops from the U.S. from Maryland and Utah and Pennsylvania and New York that haven't necessarily been deployed much overseas. So there's training all around going on.
So, Chiara, although the African Line military exercises have been held for almost 2 decades now, are these drills taking on more meaning this year, given the geopolitical security climate?
You're right. These drills have been ongoing for a long time now, but of course, the context right now is a bit different. I think the overarching purpose of these exercises is to stabilize an area, the North African Sahel area, that is highly unstable. There is a sort of, as we called it in one of our studies, a sort of vertical path of instability between Northern Africa and the Sahel. North African countries, many of them are politically unstable. Morocco is not actually, but other countries are very much, like Tunisia is experiencing a democratic backsliding. Libya is perhaps less violent than it was years ago, but it's still split into 2 different countries, let's say, with a heavy Russian presence. Egypt is almost nearing economic collapse. If it will not collapse, it will be because of the aid that it receives from the outside. But the overall situation in North Africa is very unstable, and this connects to the Sahel region very much. The Sahel region, as you know, since the 2000s, has been experiencing an increase in regime changes and coup d'etats, also regime changes through violent means very often, unfortunately. So it's very politically unstable. There is migration ongoing in the region. There is, as Mr. Lawrence was mentioning, also smugglings in goods, so illicit traffics of any kind, but also smuggling in human beings. There is a terrorist threat. And in this context, of course, there has been a bit less of Europe and the West, and a bit more of Russia and China. So I think the context is a bit different now.
So, William, although these annual exercises are overwhelmingly led by the US's Africa Command, some NATO countries are also joining them. So is that a future trend we could see, NATO being more involved in African security matters, whether it's joint exercise or other areas?
Yes, I think so, with the caveat that there was a huge international operation in Mali that completely withdrew after they were kicked out after the two Malian coups. And it seems to me that there's a little bit of buyer's remorse from European countries for being involved in these operations. I think the Malian operation at its apogee had about 60 countries involved in various ways, so far beyond the scope of these maneuvers. But there's a increasing sense that, there's a set of common threats everybody's worried about, but also a question about whether these military responses are making things better or making things worse. I would also agree with what the other guest said about the increasing political and economic instability in North Africa. But when you jump down to the Sahel, you're talking about military instability across the board, right across the region, and political instability political and economic stability that's even worse. So we're talking about the poorest region of the world that's incredibly unstable and then destabilizing its neighbors. So I think the trick here is to get the formula right of what international interventions are going to make things better and what just might hold the status quo.
So, Kira, what do you think? I mean, what are the US's military interests in West Africa? I mean, are these exercises aimed at confronting growing influence of Russia and China in the continent?
I think they are primarily, I may be wrong, but I think they are primarily in line with what has always been the US interest in Western Africa, Northern Africa, and the Sahel. Also, NATO's strategic concept has been referring to Africa as a region to focus and to the southern flank of NATO for quite a long time. It's not a novelty, let's say, stressing, of course, on the importance of addressing common challenges in the area: political instability, economic instability, poverty, terrorism, etc., etc. I agree that there may be a trend towards more NATO-US involvement in the region, although I leave a question mark, let's say, because the US has also shifted, let's say, its focus of action and interests towards other areas of the world, including China and Indo-Pacific. Right now, the US is also very much engaged in Gaza, and it is difficult, I think, that immediately, right now, the African continent will overcome these US priorities, but it may be a trend in the longer term, I think. And that is, of course, also related, yes, to come to your question, it is also clearly related to a growing Russian military presence and also growing Chinese presence, although the Chinese presence is different because it's more economic than military, as you know.
So, William, what do you think? Is the US's footprint, also the West in general, seeing their influence waning in the continent?
No. I mean, the U.S. has military relationships with all 54 countries in Africa, and it's growing. And there's been a myth of a pivot to Asia or a pivot away from the continent. It's just not true. I think what has been a problem is that the U.S. Doesn't engage as much politically with Africa in a way that political leaders in Africa want. And I also think that one of the reasons Wagner is succeeding is because the failure of some of the Western strategies. So a lot of these coup makers, and I think there have been something like 11 or 12 coups across the Sahel, West Africa, Horn of Africa region over the last 3-4 years, has been the failure against counterterrorism. So one of the ironies here is that a counterterrorism program that hasn't succeeded has then attracted support for the Russians in to fight the counterterrorism, except that instead of fighting the counterterrorism, the Russian troops tend to be involved in large massacres of civilians, arms transfers across the continent, for example, huge ones from Libya to the Sudan conflict, and plundering local resources. And then there's some buyer's remorse in these countries that, well, the Russians aren't doing better than the West. And everyone wonders if China is going to get involved militarily. But as your guest said, they're not. And so we sort of go back to having to rethink how the West engages with Africa. And if I could just add, there's that whole colonial legacy as well. So a lot of these countries have colonial reparations to deal with and difficult historical relationships that need to be ironed out. But in the end, I think it's going to have to be the West and Africa that works this out rather than the Russians and the Chinese solving it for Africa.
So, Kira, has South Africa's exercises with China and Russia last year caused a concern among Western allies?
Yes, I think they did, perhaps, but it's not, I think, what has really prompted a possible US increased engagement in the region. As you said, African Lion has been ongoing for years, so that is not a response to what has happened last year in South Africa. There is a general, let's say, reconfiguration of power balances in Northern Africa and Africa. And to put it very simply, this entails a bit less of Europe and a bit more of Russia and China. I don't see a causal direct link between those exercises of last year and what is happening now. What is sure, of course, is that Russia has increased its presence in the region. It's as you know, it's very present in the eastern part of Libya, the Cyrenaica. The Russians are discussing the opening of a military base in Derna.
Yes.
They have been discussing the opening of a military base also in Sudan for years now. And of course, Sudan and Libya, especially Libya, will be the gate for the Russians to Africa.
So, Wilma, a very quick answer. I mean, how is Rabat's geostrategic significance and surveillance of the Mediterranean and North Atlantic provide an opportunity for Western nations to engage with the continent more?
Morocco is doing a better job on just about every issue than its neighbors, but it still has a lot it can improve. I think the Moroccans, for example, are welcoming migrants now. So instead of migrants leaving the Moroccan shores to head to Europe, Morocco's giving them residency and jobs and that sort of thing, which is a great trend. Morocco's doing great in religious education. They're doing great in a lot of the other soft aspects of counterterrorism. And then in terms of the interdiction at the high seas, they're doing well as well. But everybody can do better here. And certainly Morocco's war on terror, if you can call it that, and they do, has some successful sides and some failures. And the international engagements aren't always going well. If you look at the spats between Spain and Morocco and others in the coastal areas. So there's a lot of improvements that can be made.
All right, William and Chiara, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.